The flames cast dancing shadows across Hannah Ellis's face as she frantically dipped her bucket into the water trough, her heart pounding against her ribs like a wild Mustang trying to break free. She had never imagined that her 23rd birthday would end with her family's barn engulfed in hungry flames that threatened to devour everything they had built in Springerville, Arizona Territory, 1885. "Come on," Hannah muttered through gritted teeth as she heaved another bucketful of water at the fire. The blaze merely hissed in response, mocking her efforts as it continued to consume the wooden structure. Sweat streaked down her face, mingling with the soot and tears. Her arms trembled with exhaustion, but she couldn't stop not when everything her father had worked for before his passing was disappearing before her eyes. The crackle of the fire nearly drowned out the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Hannah paid them no mind, focused solely on her task even as her lungs burned from the smoke. She staggered under the weight of another full bucket. "Miss, get back from there." A deep voice called out. Hannah ignored the warning, hurling the water at the flames. It was like throwing a thimbleful of water into the desert. Useless. But she couldn't stop trying. Strong hands suddenly gripped her shoulders, pulling her backward. Hannah spun around, ready to fight whoever was preventing her from saving what little she had left. She found herself staring up at a tall man she didn't recognize. His features were partly shadowed by his wide-brimmed hat, but she could see the concern etched across his face, illuminated by the firelight. Dust covered his riding clothes, suggesting he'd been traveling for some time. "You've done enough, let me finish it," he said firmly, taking the bucket from her trembling hands. "I can't just," she began to protest. "You'll kill yourself trying to fight this alone," he interrupted, his voice gentle but unyielding. "I've got men with me, we'll do what we can." As if on cue, 3 other riders appeared from the darkness, dismounting quickly. With practiced efficiency, they formed a line to the water trough, passing buckets between them. "Name's Garrett Quinn," the stranger said, meeting her eyes briefly before turning toward the fire. "Now stay back, miss." Hannah watched in disbelief as Garrett organized the men, shouting instructions that somehow made sense of the chaos. They worked methodically, focusing their efforts on preventing the fire from spreading to the nearby house, rather than trying to save the barn that was clearly beyond rescue. The night wore on, minutes stretching into hours as Hannah stood helplessly by, watching strangers fight to save what remained of her home. By the time dawn painted the eastern sky with pale pinks and golds, the fire had been contained. The barn was gone, but the house and the rest of the small ranch had been spared. Garrett approached her, his face blackened with soot, exhaustion evident in the slump of his broad shoulders. "I'm sorry about your barn," he said simply. Hannah nodded, her throat too tight for words. She studied him properly. For the first time, his features were strong and weathered, suggesting a man in his early 30s who spent his life outdoors. His eyes, she noticed, were a striking blue, standing out against his smoke-darkened skin. "Thank you," she finally managed. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along. Just glad we were passing through," he replied with a slight shrug. "We were heading to town when we saw the flames." "You saved my house," Hannah said, gazing at the humble structure that held everything she had left of her family. "At least I still have that." Garrett nodded, then turned to his men who were watering their horses at the trough. "We should head into town, get some supplies." Hannah felt a sudden panic at the thought of being left alone with the smoking ruins. "Wait," she called as he started to walk away. "At least let me offer you breakfast. It's the least I can do." Garrett hesitated, looking back at his companions who were clearly tired and hungry after their night's work. "That would be much appreciated, Miss Ellis." "Hannah Ellis," she supplied, suddenly self-conscious of her disheveled appearance. "Miss Ellis," he acknowledged with a slight tip of his hat, "we accept your kind offer." As the morning light strengthened, Hannah led the weary men to her house. The simple wooden structure wasn't much, just a kitchen, a small parlor, and 2 bedrooms, but it was clean and well kept. While Garrett and his men washed up outside, Hannah quickly assessed her pantry. She had enough eggs, bacon, and flour for biscuits to feed them all. By the time they filed in, the kitchen was filled with the comforting aroma of coffee and frying bacon. The men sat awkwardly at her small table, their large frames making the room seem even smaller. "This is mighty kind of you, Miss Ellis," said one of the men, introducing himself as Tom. "It's nothing compared to what you've done for me," Hannah replied, sliding plates of food before them. As they ate, Hannah learned that Garrett and his men were cattle drivers, moving a herd north from Texas to the railroad in Colorado. They'd stopped in Springerville to resupply before continuing their journey. "What about you, Miss Ellis?" Garrett asked between bites of biscuit. "Do you run this place alone?" Hannah nodded, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. "Since my father passed last year. We have a small herd, nothing like what you're driving, but enough to get by." "No other family?" he asked, his eyes studying her with quiet intensity. "None nearby. My mother died when I was young. My older brother left for California years ago." Hannah straightened her shoulders. "I managed just fine." Garrett's expression remained neutral, but she could see the doubt in his eyes. A woman running a ranch alone was uncommon, even in these changing times. "Well," he said, pushing back from the table, "we should help you clear some of that debris before we head to town. Make sure there's no danger of the fire rekindling." "You've done more than enough," Hannah protested. "It won't take long with all of us working," Garrett insisted. "Besides, I wouldn't feel right leaving until I'm sure you're safe." Hannah wanted to argue to prove she didn't need their help, but the truth was she did. With a nod of acceptance, she began clearing the dishes. Outside, the morning air was already warm, promising another scorching summer day. The men worked efficiently, removing charred timbers and ensuring no embers remained to threaten what was left of Hannah's property. As she worked alongside them, Hannah found her gaze repeatedly drawn to Garrett. Unlike many men she'd met, he didn't treat her as if she were fragile or incapable. He gave her tasks and expected her to complete them, just as he did with his men. There was something refreshing about his matter-of-fact approach. By midday, they had cleared enough of the debris to make the area safe. Hannah's hands were blistered and her back ached, but she felt a sense of accomplishment looking at what they had managed to do. "We should head into town now," Garrett said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Need to secure supplies before continuing north." Hannah nodded, feeling a strange reluctance to see them go. "Thank you again. I don't know how I can repay you." Garrett studied her for a moment, then surprised her by asking, "Will you be all right here alone, with the barn gone?" "I'll manage," Hannah replied automatically, though in truth she wasn't sure how. The barn had housed not only her animals, but also much of her feed and equipment. Rebuilding would take money she didn't have. Something in her expression must have betrayed her concerns because Garrett's brow furrowed. "Miss Ellis, would you permit me to speak plainly?" Hannah nodded cautiously. "You've suffered a significant loss. Rebuilding alone would be difficult for anyone, man or woman." He gestured toward the charred remains. "I'd like to help if you'd allow it." Hannah stiffened. "I don't accept charity, Mr. Quinn." A slight smile touched his lips. "I'm not offering charity, I'm offering fair work for fair pay." He explained that his cattle drive would take several more weeks, but on his return journey he could stop and help her rebuild. "I'm handy with tools, and I could use the work before winter sets in." Hannah hesitated. It was a practical solution, but inviting a man she barely knew to stay and work on her property would certainly set tongues wagging in Springerville. "Think about it," Garrett said, seeming to sense her hesitation. "We'll be in town tonight and leaving tomorrow. You can let me know then." Before Hannah could respond, one of his men called him over to discuss their departure. She watched as Garrett conferred with his companions, struck by the natural authority he carried without apparent effort. As the men prepared to leave, Garrett approached her once more. "One of us will ride by tomorrow morning before we head out. If you've decided you can use my help, just let them know when I should return." Hannah nodded, still uncertain. "Safe travels, Mr. Quinn." "Garrett, please," he replied with a tip of his hat. "Good day, Miss Ellis." Hannah watched them ride away, standing in her yard long after they'd disappeared from view. The reality of her situation was sinking in without the barn. She faced a precarious future. Her small herd would need shelter before winter, and she couldn't afford to hire the necessary help to rebuild quickly. Garrett's offer made practical sense, but accepting help from a man she just met went against everything her father had taught her about self-reliance. Still, she wasn't foolish enough to let pride stand in the way of survival. With a sigh, Hannah turned back to her house. She had until tomorrow to make her decision. The following morning, Hannah was already up and working when Tom, one of Garrett's men, rode into her yard. She had spent a restless night weighing her options and had finally reached a decision. "Morning, Miss Ellis," Tom called, dismounting. "Garrett asked me to check on you before we head out." Hannah nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. "Please tell Mr. Quinn that I accept his offer of help, but I insist on proper terms. We'll draw up an agreement when he returns." Tom smiled. "He figured you might say that. He said to tell you he'll be back in about 3 weeks, depending on how the drive goes." 3 weeks, Hannah repeated, calculating what she could accomplish on her own in that time. "Is there anything you need from town before we go?" Tom asked kindly. Hannah hesitated, then nodded. "If Mr. Quinn could purchase some nails and basic supplies for rebuilding, I'd be grateful. I can pay him when he returns." Tom assured her he would relay the message, then tipped his hat and rode away, leaving Hannah to face the daunting task of preparing for the barn raising on her own. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of exhausting work. Hannah salvaged what she could from the barn ruins, prepared the ground for rebuilding, and made arrangements with neighboring ranchers to temporarily house her livestock. The generosity of her neighbors surprised her. She had always kept to herself, following her father's example, but the fire had revealed a community willing to help one of their own. By the time the appointed 3 weeks had passed, Hannah had cleared the site, drawn up rough plans for a new barn, and gathered what materials she could afford. She had also prepared the small cabin that had once housed ranch hands when her father was alive. It was simple but clean, with a bed, table, and stove suitable accommodations for Garrett during his stay. On the morning marking 3 weeks since the fire, Hannah found herself watching the road more often than she cared to admit. She told herself it was merely practical concern if Garrett didn't show up. She needed to make other arrangements, but she couldn't deny a flutter of anticipation at seeing him again. It was late afternoon when she spotted a rider approaching. Hannah shaded her eyes against the setting sun, recognizing Garrett's tall figure even at a distance. He rode alone, leading a packhorse laden with supplies. Hannah smoothed her hair, suddenly conscious of her appearance in her well-worn work dress. She straightened her shoulders and walked out to meet him, determined to maintain a strictly professional demeanor. "Miss Ellis," Garrett called as he drew closer, "you're looking well." "Mr. Quinn," she acknowledged with a nod, "I trust your cattle drive was successful." He dismounted, leading his horses toward her. "It was, though not without its challenges. I see you've been busy." He gestured toward the cleared barn site. "I've done what I could," Hannah replied. "I hope you don't mind, but I've drawn up some plans based on what we can afford and what we need." Garrett smiled, and Hannah was struck again by how it transformed his weather-worn face. "I expected nothing less. Shall we discuss them over supper? I brought some supplies from town." He patted the packhorse's load. Hannah nodded, leading him toward the house. "I've prepared the hand cabin for you," she said, gesturing to the small structure near the corral. "It's not much, but it should be comfortable enough." "I'm sure it will be fine," he replied. "I've slept under the stars more nights than not these past months." As they settled into a routine over the next few days, Hannah found herself increasingly comfortable with Garrett's presence. They worked well together, with Garrett respectful of her knowledge about her own property, while contributing his considerable skill with carpentry. He never treated her as less capable because she was a woman, something Hannah found refreshingly different from most men she'd encountered. Their days fell into a pattern: early morning chores, followed by work on the barn until the afternoon heat became too intense, then resuming in the cooler evening hours. They took their meals together in Hannah's kitchen, their conversations gradually extending beyond the work at hand to personal histories and observations about life. Hannah learned that Garrett had been on his own since his late teens, working various ranch jobs across the territories before saving enough to become a cattle contractor. He had no family to speak of, or at least none he cared to mention, and seemed content with his solitary existence. "Don't you ever get lonely?" Hannah asked one evening as they sat on her porch, watching the sunset paint the Arizona sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Garrett considered the question, taking his time as he always did before speaking. I suppose I'm used to it. In my line of work, you learn to appreciate solitude, though I admit it's nice to have company sometimes. His eyes met hers briefly before returning to the horizon, leaving Hannah with an unexpected warmth spreading through her chest. What about you? He asked. Ever think about leaving this place, maybe finding somewhere easier for a woman alone? Hannah shook her head firmly. This land was everything to my father. It's all I have left of him, of my family. I couldn't abandon it. Garrett nodded, seeming to understand without further explanation. They sat in comfortable silence until darkness fell completely, each lost in their own thoughts. As the days passed, the barn began to take shape. Hannah had insisted on a smaller structure than before, knowing it would be easier to maintain, but Garrett had cleverly designed it to maximize the space. Local ranchers occasionally stopped by to lend a hand with the heavier work, and Hannah found herself becoming more integrated into the community than she had ever been during her father's lifetime. One evening, about 2 weeks into the construction, Hannah and Garrett were working late, determined to finish the roof framing before an approaching storm hit. The air was heavy with the promise of rain, the sky darkening ominously in the west. We should secure what we can and continue tomorrow, Garrett called from atop the frame, hammering down a support beam. Hannah nodded, gathering tools as the first fat raindrops began to fall. Hurry down from there, she urged, eyeing the approaching clouds with concern. Garrett had just reached the ground when the sky opened up, rain pouring down in sheets. They made a dash for the house, arriving on the porch drenched and laughing. So much for staying dry, Hannah said, wringing water from her skirt. Garrett grinned, removing his hat to shake off the water. His hair, usually hidden beneath his hat, fell across his forehead in wet strands. At least the rain will settle the dust for a few days. Hannah couldn't help but notice how different he looked without his hat, younger somehow, and even more handsome. She quickly averted her eyes, uncomfortable with the direction of her thoughts. Come in and dry off, she offered, opening the door. I'll make some coffee to warm us up. Inside, Hannah busied herself with the stove while Garrett stood awkwardly by the door, water pooling at his feet. I should probably head to the cabin, he said, gesturing at his soaked clothing. Nonsense. You'll catch your death running through this downpour again, Hannah replied practically. I have some of my father's old clothes you can change into while yours dry. Before Garrett could protest, she disappeared into her father's room, returning with a folded shirt and pants. They might be a bit short in the arms and legs, but they're dry. Garrett accepted them with thanks, and Hannah pointed him to her father's room to change. While he was gone, she changed quickly in her own room, donning a simple house dress and pinning her damp hair up as best she could. When Garrett emerged, Hannah couldn't suppress a smile. The clothes were indeed too short, exposing his wrists and ankles, but they were better than his sodden attire. I know I look ridiculous, he said good-naturedly, catching her expression. Not ridiculous, Hannah corrected. Just tall. They shared a laugh as Hannah poured coffee, the storm raging outside forgotten as they settled into the comfortable warmth of the kitchen. Their conversation flowed easily, touching on childhood memories and future hopes in a way they hadn't before. Did you always want to be a rancher? Garrett asked, his cup cradled between his hands. Hannah considered the question. Not always. When I was younger, I dreamed of teaching. I even attended a year of normal school in Phoenix before my mother fell ill. Her voice softened with the memory. After she died, Father needed help here, so I came home. By the time my brother left, I'd grown to love the ranch life. You'd have made a fine teacher, Garrett observed. You have the patience for it. And what about you? Did you always want to drive cattle across the territories? Garrett's laugh was low and warm. Hardly. I thought I might be a lawman once, like my uncle, but life has a way of setting its own course. Hannah nodded, understanding all too well how circumstances could reshape dreams. Outside, the rain continued to fall, drumming a steady rhythm on the roof. Inside, something was shifting between them, a growing awareness that neither was quite ready to acknowledge. As the evening deepened, their conversation continued, touching on books they'd read, places they'd seen, and people they'd known. Hannah couldn't remember the last time she'd talked so much or so openly with anyone. There was something about Garrett that made it easy to share thoughts she usually kept private. When the clock struck 10, Hannah realized with surprise how late it had grown. "I should check if your clothes are dry," she said, rising from her chair. Garrett's clothes, hung near the stove, were still damp. Outside, the rain showed no signs of letting up. "You can stay here tonight," Hannah offered, then quickly added, "In my father's room, I mean. It's too wet to make it to the cabin." Garrett hesitated, clearly concerned about propriety. "Are you sure? I wouldn't want to cause any talk." Hannah waved away his concern. "Who's to know? Besides, it's merely practical in this weather." Still, there was a certain awkwardness as they prepared for sleep, both acutely aware of the unusual circumstances. Hannah showed Garrett to her father's room, providing fresh linens and a towel. Their fingers brushed as she handed him an extra blanket, sending an unexpected tingle up her arm. "Good night, Mr. Quinn," she said formally, stepping back. "Good night, Miss Ellis," he replied, his voice low. "And thank you for your hospitality." In her own room, Hannah found sleep elusive. The awareness of Garrett's presence just down the hall kept her mind active, replaying moments from their evening together. It troubled her how quickly he had come to matter to her, how easily he had slipped past the careful guard she maintained around her heart. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a freshly washed landscape and a brilliant blue sky. Hannah rose early, determined to restore the normal working relationship that seemed to have shifted during the intimate evening. She was busy preparing breakfast when Garrett emerged, once again dressed in his own clothes. "Good morning," he greeted, looking somewhat uncomfortable. "I hope I didn't intrude too much on your hospitality." "Not at all," Hannah replied briskly. "The storm made it necessary." Breakfast, they ate in a silence that was more strained than their usual comfortable quiet. Hannah could feel Garrett watching her, but she kept her eyes on her plate, uncertain of the emotions stirring within her. Finally, Garrett broke the silence. "Hannah," he said the first time he had used her given name. "About last night." Hannah looked up sharply. "It was just a storm, Mr. Quinn, nothing more." He held her gaze steadily. "I wasn't referring to the storm." Hannah felt heat rise to her cheeks. "We should get back to work. The rain will have affected the timber." Garrett sighed but nodded, accepting her retreat. "Of course." They returned to the barn construction with renewed focus, both seemingly determined to maintain the professional distance that had momentarily blurred. But something had changed. Hannah could feel it in the charged atmosphere between them, in the way Garrett's eyes followed her when he thought she wasn't looking, in her own heightened awareness of his presence. The next few days passed in much the same manner, with both of them carefully navigating this new, unspoken tension. They worked efficiently together, the barn rising steadily under their combined efforts. By the end of the week, the structure was nearly complete, needing only the final touches that Hannah could manage on her own. "I think we'll finish tomorrow," Garrett announced on Friday evening as they put away their tools. "You'll have your barn before I head out." Hannah nodded, ignoring the hollow feeling his words created in her chest. "Yes, it's come along well. You've more than earned your pay." Garrett studied her face, his expression unreadable. "It wasn't about the money, Hannah, you know that." Hannah busied herself with organizing nails, avoiding his gaze. "Nevertheless, we had an agreement. I'll have your payment ready when you leave." That evening, their supper was a quiet affair, the impending completion of the barn and Garrett's departure hanging over them like a cloud. Hannah found herself memorizing details she hadn't consciously noticed before the way Garrett's hands, rough from work but surprisingly gentle, handled his utensils. The tiny scar at the corner of his left eyebrow, the deep timbre of his voice when he spoke softly. After they had cleared the dishes, Garrett surprised her by asking, "Would you walk with me a bit? It's a fine evening." Hannah hesitated, then nodded, reaching for her shawl. They walked in silence toward the newly built barn, its solid structure a testament to their weeks of labor together. The setting sun bathed everything in a golden light that softened edges and cast long shadows across the yard. "You'll do well with this place," Garrett said as they reached the barn. "You're stronger than most men I know." Hannah Ellis. Hannah felt a flush of pride at his words. Thank you. Though I couldn't have rebuilt alone. You'd have found a way, Garrett replied with conviction, but I'm glad I could help. They stood side by side, admiring their handiwork as the light faded. Hannah was acutely aware of Garrett's presence beside her, of the scant inches separating them. When he turned to face her, she found herself unable to look away from the intensity in his eyes. Hannah, he said softly, I should tell you something before I leave tomorrow. Her heart quickened. Yes, I came to Springerville for a reason. I was looking for a man who cheated me in a cattle deal last year. I tracked him here. He paused. The night of the fire, we were actually on our way back to town after searching the outlying areas. Hannah absorbed this information with surprise. Did you find him? Garrett shook his head. No, and after meeting you, helping here, it didn't seem to matter as much. He took a deep breath. What I'm trying to say is that I'm grateful for the fire in a way. If it hadn't happened, I'd have moved on without ever knowing you. Hannah's breath caught in her throat. Garrett, let me finish, he said gently. I've lived my life on the move, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. But these weeks here, working alongside you, have made me question that way of living for the first time. Hannah could feel her heart hammering in her chest. What are you saying? Garrett stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. I'm saying that I care for you, Hannah Ellis. More than I expected to, more than might be wise given how short a time we've known each other. Hannah stood frozen, a tumult of emotions rendering her speechless. Part of her wanted to step into his arms, to acknowledge the feelings that had been growing within her. Another part, the cautious, independent woman her father had raised, warned against such vulnerability. I don't expect anything, Garrett continued, seeming to sense her internal struggle. I just wanted you to know before I leave, and to ask. He hesitated, then plunged ahead. If I might write to you, perhaps visit again when my work brings me this way. The simple request broke through Hannah's hesitation. Yes, she whispered, then more firmly, yes, I'd like that. The smile that spread across Garrett's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he reached out to take her hand in his. Hannah felt the rough calluses of his palm against her own work-hardened hand, a perfect match of strength meeting strength. They stood in the gathering twilight, hands linked, the new barn a silent witness to this tentative beginning. Neither spoke for a long moment, content to exist in this fragile, precious connection. Finally, Garrett gently released her hand. It's getting dark, we should head back. Hannah nodded, suddenly shy in a way she hadn't been before. They walked back to the house slowly, their arms occasionally brushing, each contact sending ripples of awareness through Hannah. At the porch, they paused. Good night, Hannah, Garrett said softly. Thank you for the walk. Good night, Garrett, she replied, his name still new on her lips. He hesitated, then bent to place a gentle kiss on her cheek, his lips warm against her skin. Before she could react, he stepped back, tipped his hat, and walked toward the cabin, leaving Hannah standing on the porch, her fingertips pressed to the spot his lips had touched. Inside her house, Hannah moved through her evening routine in a daze, her mind replaying every word, every look, every touch they had shared. By the time she retired to bed, she had made a decision. She would not let fear prevent her from exploring these feelings further. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Hannah rose early, taking extra care with her appearance before heading to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. She was stirring a pot of oatmeal when Garrett knocked and entered, already dressed for travel. Morning, he greeted, his eyes taking in the table set for two, the coffee percolating on the stove. Good morning, Hannah replied, suddenly uncertain how to act after the previous evening's revelations. Breakfast is almost ready. They ate together, their conversation lighter than Hannah had expected, touching on the final tasks for the barn and Garrett's travel plans. It wasn't until they had finished and were clearing the dishes that Hannah broached the subject on her mind. I've been thinking about what you said last night, she began, keeping her eyes on the plate she was drying. Garrett went still beside her. And Hannah set down the plate and turned to face him. And I find that I care for you too, Garrett Quinn. More than I thought possible in such a short time. The look that crossed Garrett's face, hope mingled with happiness, gave her courage to continue. I don't know what that means for either of us, given your traveling and my commitment here, but I'd like to find out if you would." Garrett reached for her hand, his touch gentle but sure. "Nothing would make me happier, Hannah. We'll figure it out together." The final hours of Garrett's stay passed quickly as they completed the barn and settled their business arrangements. Hannah insisted on paying him as agreed, though Garrett tried to refuse. "A deal is a deal," she stated firmly. "My father taught me that much." As midday approached, Garrett prepared his horse for departure. Hannah stood in the yard, watching him secure his belongings, fighting the urge to ask him to stay longer. "I'll be heading to Colorado next," Garrett said as he tightened the cinch on his saddle. "There's a cattle buyer there I work with regularly. But I should be back this way in about 6 weeks, if that's all right with you." "I'll be here," Hannah replied simply. With his horse ready, Garrett turned to her, seeming reluctant to leave. "6 weeks isn't so long," he said, as much to himself as to her. "No, not so long," Hannah agreed, though it felt like an eternity. Garrett stepped closer, his eyes seeking permission. When Hannah didn't pull away, he gently cupped her face in his hands and bent to kiss her, not on the cheek this time, but softly on the lips. It was brief but tender, a promise rather than a demand. "I'll write when I reach Colorado," he said as they parted. Hannah nodded, not trusting her voice. She watched as Garrett mounted and rode away, staying in the yard until he was just a speck on the horizon. Only then did she turn back to her house, already counting the days until his return. The 6 weeks of Garrett's absence passed more slowly than Hannah could have imagined. She kept busy with ranch work, settling her animals into the new barn and preparing for the coming winter, but her thoughts often strayed to the tall cowboy who had so unexpectedly entered her life. True to his word, Garrett wrote regularly. His letters arrived every week or so, carried by the stagecoach that passed through Springerville. Hannah savored each one, reading them by lamplight in the evening, tracing his strong handwriting with her fingers as if it might bring him closer. His letters were like the man himself, straightforward, yet thoughtful, sharing details of his journey and business dealings alongside observations about the changing landscapes he traversed. Between the lines, Hannah could read his growing affection for her, making her own feelings deepen despite the distance separating them. Hannah wrote back faithfully, finding it easier to express her thoughts on paper than she ever had in person. She told him about the ranch, her daily routines, and slowly began to share more personal reflections, her dreams, her fears, her hopes for the future. It was a kind of courtship neither had anticipated but both embraced wholeheartedly. The community of Springerville noticed the change in Hannah. She was more engaged, attending church socials and participating in town events she had previously avoided. When curious neighbors inquired about the man who had helped rebuild her barn, Hannah was honest but reserved, not yet ready to define what was growing between them. 5 weeks after Garrett's departure, Hannah received a letter that made her heart leap with anticipation. He had concluded his business in Colorado more quickly than expected and was already on his way back to Arizona. He would reach Springerville within a week, if the weather held. Hannah read and reread the letter, excitement and nervousness battling within her. In the days that followed, she found herself distracted, starting tasks only to abandon them midway, her mind constantly wandering to thoughts of Garrett's impending arrival. The night before he was due to return, Hannah barely slept, her mind filled with questions. What if things were different in person? What if the connection they had built through letters didn't translate to real life? What if he had changed his mind about her? Morning found her exhausted but resolute. Whatever happened, she would face it with the same courage she had shown throughout her life. She dressed with care in her best everyday dress, a deep blue that brought out the color in her eyes, and pinned her hair in a style that was practical yet becoming. Hannah was in the corral, working with a young horse, when she heard approaching hoofbeats. Her heart stuttered in her chest as she turned to see Garrett riding toward the ranch, his familiar figure a welcome sight against the Arizona landscape. She forced herself to finish the training exercise before calmly exiting the corral. By then, Garrett had reached the yard and dismounted, securing his horse to the hitching post. He stood waiting for her, hat in hand, a tentative smile on his face. "Hannah," he said simply as she approached, "Welcome back," she replied, suddenly shy despite all they had shared in their letters. They stood for a moment, taking in the changes 6 weeks had wrought in each other. Garrett looked leaner, his skin darkened further by the sun, a new scar on his hand that hadn't been there before. Hannah wondered what differences he saw in her. "You look well," he said finally, his eyes warm with appreciation. "As do you," she responded, finding her composure. "Are you hungry, thirsty?" Garrett's smile widened. "Both, but mostly, I'm happy to see you." The simple honesty of his statement broke through Hannah's nervousness. She returned his smile, feeling the connection between them solidify once more. "Come inside. I'll put on some coffee." In the kitchen, they fell into conversation more easily than Hannah had feared, moving from the practicalities of Garrett's journey to deeper subjects they had explored in their letters. The awkwardness that had marked their early interactions was gone, replaced by a comfortable familiarity that felt both new and entirely natural. As evening approached, Garrett helped Hannah with her chores, the two of them working together as seamlessly as they had during the barn raising. The routine tasks took on a different quality with Garrett by her side, transforming from necessary labor to shared experience. After supper, they sat on the porch as had become their custom, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues. Hannah was acutely aware of Garrett beside her, of the scant space between them on the bench, of the way his hand occasionally brushed hers as they talked. "I've been thinking," Garrett said during a lull in the conversation, his voice thoughtful, "about the future." Hannah turned to look at him, her heart quickening. "Oh," Garrett nodded, his eyes on the distant horizon. "I'm not getting any younger, Hannah. This life on the move, it served its purpose, but lately I've been wondering if there might be something more." "What kind of something more?" Hannah asked softly. He met her gaze then, his expression earnest. "A home, a place to belong, someone to build a life with." Hannah's breath caught in her throat. "That's a big change for a man used to the open road." "It is," he agreed, "but the right person makes such changes worth considering." The implication hung between them, clear but not yet explicitly stated. Hannah found herself at a crossroads, knowing her response could alter the course of both their lives. "Garrett," she began carefully, "are you saying what I think you're saying?" He took her hand in his touch gentle but sure. "I'm saying that these weeks apart only confirmed what I already knew. I care deeply for you, Hannah Ellis. I believe we could build something good together if you're willing." Hannah looked down at their joined hands, her mind racing. She had lived independently for so long, had fought to maintain her father's legacy through sheer determination. Opening her life to another person to Garrett would change everything. "I care for you too," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I won't leave this ranch. It's my home, my heritage." "I'd never ask you to," Garrett assured her. "In fact, I was hoping." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "I was hoping there might be a place for me here with you." Hannah looked up in surprise. "You'd stay, give up your travels?" "For the right reason," he said simply. "For you." The magnitude of what he was offering struck Hannah profoundly. This was no small concession from a man who had lived his life on horseback, following the changing seasons across territories. "I don't want you to resent me," she said, voicing her deepest fear. "If you stayed and found yourself trapped." Garrett shook his head firmly. "I know my own mind, Hannah. I've had these 6 weeks to consider it from every angle. Being with you, building a life together, that's worth more than any freedom the road could offer." Hannah studied his face, searching for any sign of doubt or hesitation. She found none, only clear-eyed certainty and warm affection that mirrored her own feelings. "Then yes," she said, her voice strengthening with conviction. "Yes, I'd like to build that life with you." The joy that spread across Garrett's face was like sunshine breaking through clouds. He lifted her hand to his lips, placing a gentle kiss on her knuckles. "You've made me the happiest of men, Hannah Ellis." They sat together as darkness fell, planning their future in quiet voices. Garrett would make one final trip to settle his affairs and fulfill outstanding obligations, then return permanently to Springerville. They would work the ranch together, combining his experience with cattle and her knowledge of the land to build something greater than either could achieve alone. As the stars emerged in the velvet sky above them, Garrett drew Hannah into his arms for the first time. His embrace was strong yet gentle, making her feel both protected and cherished. When he kissed her, it was with a tenderness that spoke of patience and respect, but also with a passion that promised much more. "I should go," he murmured when they finally parted, both breathless from the kiss. Before propriety is entirely forgotten, Hannah nodded, though she was reluctant to end this perfect moment. "When will you leave for your final trip?" "Day after tomorrow," Garrett replied. "It shouldn't take more than 3 weeks to conclude everything, then I'll be back for good." The following day, they rode into Springerville together to share their news with the necessary parties. The reaction was largely positive. Hannah was well respected in the community, and Garrett had made a good impression during his previous stay. They visited the minister to discuss their intention to marry upon Garrett's return, then stopped at the general store for supplies. News of their engagement spread quickly through the small town. Most offered congratulations, though Hannah noticed a few disapproving glances from those who considered their courtship scandalously brief. She found, to her surprise, that such opinions mattered little compared to the certainty she felt about her decision. When they returned to the ranch, they spent the evening finalizing plans for Garrett's absence and subsequent return. They agreed that he would be back by the first week of November, giving them time to marry before winter set in fully. "I was thinking," Garrett said as they sat before the fire, "we could expand the cattle operation once I'm settled here. The market's strong, and with both of us working together, we could handle a larger herd." Hannah nodded, appreciating how he included her in these plans rather than taking over. "Father always said this land could support twice what we currently graze. We'd need to improve the water access on the north pasture, though." They continued discussing possibilities until late in the evening, their shared vision for the ranch's future cementing their partnership in ways that went beyond the personal connection growing between them. The morning of Garrett's departure arrived too quickly. Hannah rose at dawn to prepare a hearty breakfast, determined to send him off well provisioned for his journey. They ate mostly in silence, both aware of the impending separation yet confident in what awaited on the other side of it. As Garrett prepared his horse, Hannah packed the food she had prepared for his first days on the trail. It was a familiar ritual for both of them, yet charged with new meaning now that they had committed their futures to each other. 3 weeks, Garrett reminded her as he mounted his horse. "I'll be back before you know it," Hannah nodded, tilting her face up for his farewell kiss. "Safe travels," she whispered against his lips. "Keep that barn standing," he replied with a smile, an echo of their first meeting that made her laugh despite the tightness in her throat. Hannah watched him ride away, the rising sun casting long shadows across the land they would soon share as husband and wife. 3 weeks, she thought. She had waited longer for less important things. The first 2 weeks of Garrett's absence passed slowly but productively. Hannah threw herself into preparations for his return, repairing the hand cabin where he would stay until their wedding, and making small improvements to the house they would eventually share. She ordered fabric from the mercantile for new curtains, and began piecing together a quilt for their bed, traditional tasks for a bride to be that Hannah approached with practical efficiency rather than romantic sentimentality. Letters arrived regularly, marking Garrett's progress as he traveled north to conclude his business dealings. His words were full of plans and promises, each letter ending with a countdown of days until his return. Hannah kept them bundled together, reading them in the evenings when the ranch work was done, and the house felt especially empty. As the 3rd week began, Hannah found herself watching the road more frequently, though she knew it was too early for Garrett's return. She was hanging laundry in the yard when she saw a rider approaching not from the direction she expected Garrett to come, and moving too quickly for casual travel. Hannah shaded her eyes, recognizing Tom, one of the men who had helped fight the fire and worked with Garrett on his cattle drives. Something about his posture tense, urgent sent a chill through her even before he reached the yard. "Miss Ellis," Tom called, dismounting hastily. His face was grave, his clothing dusty from hard riding. "What is it?" Hannah asked, her hands stilling on the wet sheet she had been hanging. "Is it Garrett?" Tom removed his hat, confirming her fears before he even spoke. "There was trouble, Miss Ellis. Up north near the territorial border. Hannah's world narrowed to Tom's voice, everything else fading to inconsequential background. "Tell me," she demanded, her voice steadier than she felt. Rustlers hit the herd Garrett was delivering. He and the boys fought them off, but Garrett took a bullet. "He's alive," Tom added quickly, seeing the color drain from Hannah's face. "But he's in bad shape." They got him to a doctor in Holbrook. "Holbrook," Hannah repeated, her mind already calculating distances, preparations needed. "That's a day's ride." Tom nodded. "He's asking for you. I came as fast as I could." Hannah took a deep breath, forcing back the panic threatening to overwhelm her. "Give me 15 minutes to pack and saddle my horse." Tom looked uncertain. "It's not proper for you to travel alone. I don't give a damn about proper," Hannah cut him off, her voice sharp. "Garrett needs me. Are you coming with me or not?" Seeing the determination in her eyes, Tom simply nodded. "Yes, madam. I'll ready your horse while you pack." Hannah moved with focused efficiency, gathering only what was essential: a change of clothes, her father's old pistol, and what little money she had saved. She penned quick notes to her nearest neighbors asking them to look after her livestock, left them prominently on the kitchen table, and closed the door on her home without looking back. The ride to Holbrook was grueling, Hannah pushing herself and her horse to their limits despite Tom's concerned warnings about the pace. They stopped only when absolutely necessary, eating in the saddle and resting the horses just enough to prevent them from foundering. As night fell, Hannah refused to make camp, insisting they continue by moonlight. "He'd do the same for me," she said simply when Tom suggested they rest until dawn. They reached Holbrook shortly after sunrise the next day, Hannah stiff and exhausted but focused solely on finding Garrett. Tom led her to a small building near the town's only hotel, where the local doctor had his practice and kept rooms for patients too ill to be moved. The doctor, a grizzled older man named Peterson, met them at the door. "Miss Ellis, I presume," he said, taking in her dust-covered appearance and weary eyes. "He's been asking for you." "How is he?" Hannah asked, following the doctor inside. Dr. Peterson's expression was guarded. The bullet went clean through his shoulder, which is fortunate. "But there's infection setting in, and he's lost a good deal of blood. The next day or two will tell the tale." Hannah's heart constricted painfully, but she kept her composure. "I want to see him." The doctor led her to a small, clean room at the back of the building. Hannah paused in the doorway, steeling herself before looking at the still figure on the narrow bed. Garrett lay pale and motionless, his normally vigorous presence diminished by injury and fever. A bandage covered his left shoulder, spots of blood showing through the white cloth. His breathing was shallow, his face drawn with pain even in sleep. Hannah moved to his side, gently taking his hand in hers. His skin was hot to the touch, confirming the doctor's words about infection. "Garrett," she said softly, "I'm here." His eyelids fluttered, then opened slowly, his gaze unfocused at first. When he registered her presence, a weak smile touched his lips. "Hannah," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You came." "Of course I came," she replied, blinking back tears. "Nothing could have stopped me." Garrett's eyes drifted closed again, the brief exchange seemingly having exhausted his limited strength. The doctor touched Hannah's shoulder gently. "He needs rest, and from the look of you, so do you." Hannah shook her head firmly. "I'm staying with him." Seeing the determination in her face, Dr. Peterson sighed. "At least let me have a cot brought in. You'll be no good to him if you collapse yourself." Hannah reluctantly agreed, knowing he was right. While arrangements were made, she washed quickly in the basin provided, changing into her clean clothes. When she returned to Garrett's room, a narrow cot had been placed against the wall and a tray with bread, cheese, and coffee waited on the small table. "Eat," the doctor instructed. "Then rest. I'll check on him regularly, and you can spell me when you wake." Too exhausted to argue, Hannah did as she was told, though she moved her cot closer to Garrett's bed so she could reach out and touch his hand if she woke. Despite her intention to merely rest her eyes, she fell into a deep sleep almost immediately, her body surrendering to the demands of the grueling journey. When Hannah woke, the light in the room had changed, suggesting several hours had passed. She sat up quickly, her eyes going immediately to Garrett. He was awake, watching her with a clarity that hadn't been present earlier. "Hello," he said softly as she moved to his side. Hannah touched his forehead, relieved to find it cooler than before. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been shot," he replied with a weak attempt at humor. "But better for seeing you." Hannah smiled despite her concern, encouraged by his lucidity. "The doctor says you're fighting an infection, but you're strong, you'll beat this." Garrett nodded slightly, grimacing at the movement. "Sorry about the delay in our plans," he murmured. "Didn't mean to get myself shot." "Hush," Hannah scolded gently. "The only thing that matters is you getting well." Over the next 3 days, Hannah rarely left Garrett's side, assisting Dr. Peterson with changing bandages, coaxing Garrett to eat, and cooling his fever when it spiked during the night. The infection battled fiercely, leaving Garrett alternating between periods of lucidity and feverish delirium. During the worst moments, Hannah held his hand and spoke steadily of the future they would build together, determined that her voice would anchor him to life. On the 4th day, the fever broke. Hannah woke from a brief nap to find Garrett watching her, his eyes clear and alert for the first time since her arrival. The color had returned to his face, and though he was still weak, the dangerous pallor had receded. "You look terrible," he observed with a hint of his usual humor. Hannah laughed, relief washing through her. "Such flattery, no wonder I agreed to marry you." Dr. Peterson confirmed what Hannah had already recognized. The crisis had passed. Garrett would recover, though complete healing would take time. "He'll need to rest that shoulder for at least 6 weeks, the doctor cautioned. "No riding, no lifting, certainly no ranching." "He can rest at home," Hannah said firmly. "I'll see to it." Arrangements were made for their return to Springerville. Unable to ride, Garrett would travel by wagon, with Hannah driving and Tom accompanying them for security. The doctor insisted they wait another 2 days to ensure Garrett was strong enough for the journey, a precaution Hannah gratefully accepted despite Garrett's impatience to leave. The evening before their departure, Hannah sat beside Garrett's bed, their hands intertwined as they discussed the practicalities of the coming weeks. Garrett's frustration at his temporary helplessness was evident, though he tried to mask it. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly, interrupting their conversation about rearranging the bedroom to accommodate his recovery. "This isn't how I wanted to start our life together." Hannah squeezed his hand. "We're alive and together, that's all that matters." Garrett studied her face, his expression serious. "You've been extraordinary, Hannah. Not many women would have ridden day and night to reach a wounded man, then stayed to nurse him without complaint." "Not many women love as I love you," Hannah replied simply. Her words hung in the air between them, the first time either had explicitly spoken of love rather than care or affection. Garrett's eyes widened slightly, then softened with emotion. "I love you, Hannah Ellis," he said, his voice low and fervent. "More than I ever thought possible." Hannah leaned down to kiss him gently, mindful of his injury. "Then we're well matched, Garrett Quinn, because I love you just as much." The journey back to Springerville was slow and difficult, each bump in the rough road causing Garrett pain despite Hannah's careful driving. They traveled only during the cooler morning and evening hours, making camp during the heat of the day to allow Garrett to rest. Hannah watched him constantly, alert for any sign of returning fever or excessive fatigue. Though he maintained a brave front, she could see how the journey taxed his weakened body. By the time they approached Springerville on the 3rd day, Garrett was pale with exhaustion, his jaw clenched against the persistent pain of his healing wound. Word of their arrival spread quickly through the small community. By the time they reached Hannah's ranch, neighbors had gathered to welcome them, bringing food and offers of assistance that Hannah accepted gratefully. She had Garrett settled in the main house rather than the hand cabin, propriety giving way to practical concerns about his care. In the days that followed, Hannah established a new routine centered around Garrett's recovery. She divided her time between essential ranch chores and caring for her patient, who chafed increasingly at his enforced idleness. "I should be helping you," Garrett insisted as Hannah prepared to head out for the morning feeding. "At least let me advise on the cattle rotation." Hannah smiled patiently. "You can advise all you want from that chair, doctor's orders." Despite his frustration, Garrett's recovery progressed steadily. By the 3rd week, He was able to move around the house with minimal discomfort, though lifting anything heavier than a coffee cup was still prohibited. He filled his time by reviewing Hannah's account books, suggesting improvements to the ranch's financial management that she implemented with good results. Their unconventional living arrangement raised eyebrows in the community, but Hannah faced any criticism directly. "We're to be married as soon as he's well enough," she told the minister's wife when the woman delicately raised the subject. "Would you rather I left him to fend for himself?" Most neighbors were understanding, offering help rather than judgment. The women brought meals and sewing work that Hannah could complete while sitting with Garrett. The men assisted with heavier ranch chores that she couldn't manage alone. Through these daily interactions, Hannah found herself more integrated into the community than ever before. As Garrett's strength returned, they made plans for their wedding, agreeing on a simple ceremony once he could stand without discomfort. Hannah ordered fabric for a wedding dress, working on it in the evenings while Garrett read aloud from one of her father's old books. These quiet domestic moments created a foundation for their future, together a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine affection that deepened daily. They learned each other's habits and preferences, negotiating the small adjustments that would allow two independent people to build a harmonious life together. 6 weeks after their return to Springerville, Dr. Peterson visited to examine Garrett's healing wound. "You've made remarkable progress," he pronounced, probing the scarred tissue with gentle fingers. "I believe you can resume light work, nothing strenuous, mind you, but enough to make you feel useful again." Garrett's relief was palpable. "And riding?" he asked eagerly. The doctor hesitated, then nodded. "Short distances at a walk, no galloping after stray cattle just yet." With the doctor's approval, they set a date for their wedding the second Saturday of December, just 2 weeks away. Hannah completed her wedding dress, a simple but elegant creation in cream-colored fabric with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. Garrett ordered a new suit from the tailor in town, insisting on proper attire despite Hannah's assurances that his regular Sunday clothes would suffice. The morning of their wedding dawned clear and cold, the winter sun casting a golden light across the frost-covered landscape. Hannah dressed with the help of a neighbor woman, her fingers trembling slightly as she pinned her hair into an elaborate style she had practiced for days. "You look beautiful, dear," the older woman said, adjusting the collar of Hannah's dress. "Your young man won't know what hit him." Hannah smiled, studying her reflection in the small mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed different, somehow still herself, but softer, her usual practical expression warmed by happiness. The ceremony itself was simple but meaningful, held in the small church that Hannah had attended sporadically since childhood. The building was crowded with neighbors and friends, more people than Hannah had realized cared about her happiness. Garrett waited at the altar, tall and handsome in his new suit, his eyes never leaving her as she walked down the aisle alone. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, his voice solemn in the hushed church, "we are gathered here today." The traditional words washed over Hannah as she stood beside Garrett, their hands joined between them. She thought of the night they had met, of fire and fear, and a stranger's kindness that had changed the course of her life. Who could have predicted that the cowboy who took a bucket from her hands would one day take her heart as well? When the time came to speak their vows, Hannah's voice was clear and strong, matching Garrett's firm declarations. The simple gold bands they exchanged were modest, reflecting their practical natures, but the promises they represented were boundless. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the minister concluded. "Mr. Quinn, you may kiss your bride." Garrett's kiss was gentle yet possessive, appropriate for the church setting but hinting at deeper passion to come. As they turned to face their friends and neighbors as husband and wife, Hannah felt a sense of rightness settle over her, a certainty that this path, unexpected as it had been, was exactly where she was meant to be. The celebration continued at the ranch, where neighbors had prepared a feast while the ceremony took place. The house was filled with laughter and conversation, the community coming together to honor the new couple in traditional Western style. As evening approached, the guests gradually departed, leaving Hannah and Garrett alone for the first time as husband and wife. They stood on the porch, watching the last wagon disappear down the road. "Well, Mrs. Quinn," Garrett said, his arm around her waist. "How does it feel to be a married woman?" Hannah leaned into his embrace, savoring his warmth against the December chill. "Surprisingly natural," she admitted. "Though I may keep using Ellis for the ranch business people know the name," Garrett chuckled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Always practical, my Hannah. It's one of the things I love about you." They returned inside to the house that was now truly theirs together. Hannah had made small changes in preparation for their marriage, rearranging furniture to accommodate Garrett's belongings, hanging new curtains she had sewn herself, adding a larger bed to the main bedroom that had once been her father's. As night fell, any awkwardness that might have existed between them dissolved in the genuine affection they had built over months of knowing each other. Their coming together as husband and wife was a natural extension of the partnership they had already formed, tender yet passionate, marked by mutual desire and deep respect. Later, as they lay together in the darkness, Hannah rested her head on Garrett's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I never expected this," she murmured. "After Father died, I thought it would just be me and this ranch until the end of my days." Garrett's hand moved gently through her hair, now loose around her shoulders. "And I never expected to find a home after so many years on the move, yet here we are." "Here we are," Hannah echoed, contentment warming her voice. "And here we'll stay." The winter passed in a haze of newly wedded happiness as Hannah and Garrett settled into married life. They established routines that honored both their individual strengths and their partnership, Garrett gradually taking over more of the physical ranch work as his shoulder healed completely, Hannah continuing to manage the accounts and household while sharing in the daily chores. With Garrett's experience in cattle trading, they expanded their herd that spring, purchasing additional stock at favorable prices and improving the breeding lines. Hannah's knowledge of the land complemented Garrett's business acumen, creating a profitable operation that grew steadily under their joint management. By their first anniversary, Hannah was carrying their child, her body softening with new life as winter again blanketed the Arizona high country. Garrett's protectiveness increased tenfold, though he was careful not to smother Hannah's independent spirit. "I'm pregnant, not helpless," she reminded him when he tried to take the laundry basket from her hands. "Humor me," he replied with a smile that still made her heart quicken. "It's my first time being a father." Their son was born the following summer, a healthy, robust boy they named James Thomas Quinn, honoring both their fathers. Hannah took to motherhood with the same determination and competence she brought to everything, while Garrett proved to be a doting father who carried the infant with him around the ranch whenever possible. As young James grew, so did the ranch's prosperity. Garrett's connections in the cattle market and Hannah's careful stewardship of their resources allowed them to purchase adjacent land, doubling their holdings by the time their second child, a daughter named Mary Elizabeth, arrived 2 years later. 5 years after the night of the fire that had brought them together, Hannah stood on the porch of their expanded home, watching Garrett teaching 4-year-old James to throw a lasso in the yard. Mary played nearby, her chubby hands building towers with wooden blocks Garrett had carved during the long winter evenings. The ranch had grown almost beyond recognition from the struggling operation Hannah had managed alone. New outbuildings stood where the old barn had burned, larger and better constructed. The herd had tripled in size, requiring additional hands during the busy seasons. The house itself had been expanded, adding rooms for their growing family and modern conveniences that made Hannah's work easier. Yet for all these external changes, the most significant transformation had been within Hannah herself. The fiercely independent woman who had once tried to fight a barn fire alone had learned the strength that comes from partnership, from loving and being loved in return. As if sensing her thoughts, Garrett looked up, meeting her gaze across the yard. The smile they shared held years of shared experiences, challenges overcome, and joy discovered together. "Mama, look," James called, successfully twirling his small rope in a wobbly circle. "Well done." Hannah called back, descending the porch steps to join her family. Garrett welcomed her with an arm around her waist, pulling her close as they watched their son's determined practice. "He has your stubbornness," he observed with a chuckle. "And your charm," Hannah returned. "Heaven help us when he's grown." As the afternoon sun bathed the ranch in golden light, Hannah reflected on the unexpected path her life had taken. From the desperate woman with a bucket fighting a losing battle against flames to the wife, mother, and successful rancher, she had become all because a passing cowboy had stopped to help. "What are you thinking about?" Garrett asked, noting her contemplative expression. Hannah smiled, leaning into his embrace. "About buckets and fire, and how sometimes the best things in life come from the worst moments." Garrett's arm tightened around her, understanding without further explanation. "You've done enough, let me finish it," he quoted softly, the words that had begun their story. "The best offer I ever accepted," Hannah replied, turning to kiss him as their children played in the yard of the home they had built together, not just the physical structures, but the life they had created from that chance meeting on a fiery night so many years before. In the decades that followed, the Quinn Ranch became one of the most prosperous in the territory. James grew into a thoughtful young man who combined his father's business acumen with his mother's practical wisdom, eventually taking over the main operations while his parents enjoyed a well-earned reduction in responsibilities. Mary, as spirited as her mother had been, pursued education in Phoenix before returning to help modernize the family business for the new century. Though time etched lines on their faces and slowed their steps, Hannah and Garrett's partnership remained strong, a testament to the love that had blossomed between a determined woman and the cowboy who had recognized her strength, even as he offered his help. Their story became part of local lore, retold at community gatherings and family reunions, a reminder that even in the harshest circumstances, hope and new beginnings could arise from the ashes. And on cool evenings, long after their children had families of their own, Hannah and Garrett could still be seen sitting together on the porch of the home they had built, their hands intertwined as they watched the sunset paint the sky in hues reminiscent of the fire that had first brought them together, a blaze extinguished long ago, but whose warmth had sustained them through a lifetime of love.